final project on domestic policy in Venezuela and Germany. In this slideshow, we'll be going over the government of Venezuela, the government of Germany, poverty within these nations, and what the future holds for each of these countries. We're going to start off with a quote by Winston Churchill, where he describes socialism as, quote, "the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery." In this first section, we'll be talking about the government of Venezuela. Around the turn of the century, Hugo Chavez was the president of Venezuela. He was actually able to implement a relatively successful socialist government that was prosperous for a while. This was due to Venezuela being turned into a petro-state, meaning the value of their currency depended on the value of a barrel of oil. With Venezuela having so many reserves, they quickly had more money than they knew what to do with. However, over the course of 10 to 15 years, economic mismanagement and corruption plagued Venezuela, leaving it completely dependent on its oil exports. This led to disaster when the price of oil collapsed in 2014. With Chavez's untimely death, Maduro took over right around the same time. He proposed a solution to the crashing economy that mainly consisted of printing what the government needed to fund its socialist programs. Eventually, hyperinflation took over and protests erupted. This led to the government using extreme violence in order to quell the protests. A humanitarian crisis was declared, and people began to starve as they could not afford food. Then, people began to flee in the hundreds of thousands. As of today, the government does its best to stop people from leaving, often using violence against its own citizens. Venezuela remains in a state of extreme poverty and violence. People cannot afford basic necessities, and the country cannot even afford to import these goods. As long as Maduro remains in power, there is no end in sight.
Right, this is section 2, Government of Germany. Federal Republic of Germany. This is about Germany today. Germany has been through many governments over the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, it was a constitutional monarchy, which is the same government that fought in World War I. After the tragic events of World War I, Germany became the Weimar Republic, which was the government of Germany from 1918 to 1933. This form of government had a parliamentary system, authoritarianism, federal republic, representative democracy, and a semi-presidential system. This government eventually formed into the German Reich, or commonly known as Nazi Germany. Following the events of World War II, Germany became the Federal Republic of Germany, which is the government it possesses today. Germany today is a federal republic, which consists of a parliamentary and federal democracy. The German Bundestag, the constitutional body, is directly elected by the citizens. Most tasks of the Bundestag are legislative and to oversee the government's work. The Bundestag also elects the federal chancellor for the legislative period by secret ballot. The chancellor has the authority to lay down guidelines and appoint federal ministers. The federal president is the most senior political person in the country, holding the highest office. The federal president is not elected by the people, but however, he or she is elected by the Federal Assembly. Today, Germany is ranked 4th in the globe for the most powerful nation, following Russia in the number 3rd spot. Germany is the leading country in not only just the EU, but in all of Europe, excluding Russia. Germany's economy has its great innovations and strong focus on exports to thank for its competitiveness, and global networking. Some high-selling sectors are car manufacturing, mechanical and plant engineering, the chemical industry and medical technology. Exports account for well over half the total sales. Germany's economy, healthcare, natural resources, education, and EU/NATO membership is primarily where the German power comes from.
For a project, I did part 3, poverty in these nations. For poverty in Germany, after World War I, Germany was in so much debt that it killed the country's economy. It caused millions of people to go into poverty. The same followed after World War II. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, ending World War I. This treaty gave Germany many reparations that they could not pay back. This led to the rise of the Nazi Party, which then ended up starting World War II. After World War II was over, Germany had to deal with many reparations yet again, which led to a depression within the country. The reconstruction of Germany has been very impressive. It has taken them a long time to get back to what they were before, but better living conditions, a reduction of unemployment, and increased food production were all big parts of the reconstruction. For poverty in Venezuela, Venezuela's economy was thriving with the discovery of oil in the country. Venezuela was at one point in 1970 one of the richest countries in the world. Then in 1999, Hugo Chavez took over and implemented many socialism values and beliefs. The beginning of his leadership was actually okay, but then things started going downhill. The country started to rely only on their oil industry, and when the global oil prices dropped, the whole country went into poverty. Now Venezuela is one of the most unstable countries in the world. People are trying to flee the country to find better living conditions. The government tried printing money, but that just led to hyperinflation. Now Venezuelans live on $1.90 a day.
All right, so our last section, what does the future hold for both Germany and Venezuela with regards to poverty in those nations? So, Germany today is home to Europe's largest economy. The nation is depended on by other nations in the European Union for money lending and trade as well. This aspect of the country will ensure its success in the future. And Germany, even though it's very successful in the area of, especially in the region of Europe, is very independent on its automobile industry. And in the past, Germany's economy has loosely followed the prosperity of its car industry. When the car industry increases in value, so does the German economy and vice versa. So Germany does, however, depend on China for a majority of its trade partnerships in the automobile industry. And in the future, Germany is going to be forced to navigate the dangerous waters of maintaining a good relationship with the communist nation while also avoiding being used as a pawn in China's pocket. Germany has also maintained a free market economy with some movement towards a more socialist system, and this system has seemed to work for the time being and continues to look prosperous. And now Venezuela. So Venezuela is considered to be a failed state. Its economic collapse and the failure of the communist socialist regime has been disastrous to its image and ability to trade with many nations, especially the United States, which placed many sanctions on it during that time. Now, despite the disaster that looms over the nation, there is some hope for the country. And this hope is entirely dependent on negotiations between the Maduro regime and the democratic opposition in the government. Neither group can succeed without the approval of the other. And while the Democratic Party in Venezuela has the ability and means to bring peace and prosperity to the nation, it needs the support of the Maduro regime, who has the sway of the people behind them. Without this cooperation, further social unrest is definitely inevitable. And the United States plays an essential role in the success of negotiations. They have rescinded the prior stance on negotiations, which have stated that control of Venezuela must be handed over to the Democratic minority with no conditions. And instead, the United States has insisted that negotiations must take place in order for Venezuela to reach a state of recovery. And that is all.